Thank you all for coming to this early session. Pretty impressive turnout. I know Finns are stereotypically early risers, but still a 9 a.m. Sunday panel is quite impressive, so thank you all for coming. We have a really interesting panel this morning to discuss something that's in some way or other probably been an element of almost everything that's been discussed here. But we're going to try and do it in more focus, and that's Russia and the future of the European security order. In order next to me, we've got Sam Charap, Distinguished Chair in Russia and Eurasia Policy at RAND, Sinikukka Saari, Leading Researcher at FIIA, Nigel Gould-Davies, Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Hanna, Notte, the Director of the Eurasia Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. I'm Shaun Walker. I'm a Guardian journalist. I used to be based in Moscow for many years. Now I live in Warsaw, and I mostly cover Ukraine and some of the non-military security challenges that Russia poses to Europe at the moment. So I thought we'd start. We've talked a lot over the last couple of days about European responses, about what Europe needs to do, what Europe should do, what Europe's failing to do. But maybe in this panel, it's useful to reverse it a little bit and to look at Russia and what Russia wants, both in the short term with the way we're seeing Moscow testing Europe in the last few weeks, but also in the much bigger picture. What are Russia's main strategic goals at the moment? Is everything we're seeing about winning its space in Ukraine, or is there a much bigger and broader picture here about redrawing the kind of Europe that sits next to Russia? So I thought we'd start with you, Sinikukka, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you see Russia's view on everything that's happening.
Right. So if we start with, what does Russia want? Kind of very fundamental question. I think the answer lies on three levels. First of all, I think very concretely, Russia wants to delimit Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. It wants to subjugate Ukraine politically and militarily. Secondly, it wants to undo the European security order. It wants to have a bigger role in European security. It wants to see spheres of influence. And thirdly, of course, Russia wants to re-establish and consolidate its great power status globally. And I think all these three goals have been there since at least the early 2000s, probably even earlier. So they are very consistent. But what has changed is, of course, that the way in which it attempts to achieve them has become more and more aggressive, much more risk-prone, and this is the way. And I think in Moscow, it has interpreted that this aggressive strategy has been very successful. So that's why we do have this war in Ukraine. And I think sadly, Moscow actually believes that Ukraine is really the key to achieve these goals on all these three different levels. I mean, firstly, Russia cannot attract Ukraine into its spheres of influence, so hence it needs to coerce Ukraine into submission. Then secondly, I think through this protracted war, the war of attrition, it can also dismantle the European security order. And then thirdly, I think that by revealing the weakness of the West, and European actors, it also can gain more prominence globally, and it can really consolidate its great power status at the expense of whatever used to be called the West.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, something that seems to have become a bit of a mantra recently is that one of the things that European countries need to do in the peace process is change Russia's strategic goals, that's going to be the way to some kind of a settlement. I wanted to come to you, Nigel. First of all, whether you agree with that assessment of what Russia wants, and secondly, when you look at the relative strength of the European nations as compared to Russia, it seems like on paper there should be enough to change Russia's strategic goals. So is this something in the current setup that's a realistic prospect, and how could it be best achieved?
Well, firstly, on the matter of Russia's intentions, yes, I agree with everything that Sinikukka said, and indeed in some respects would amplify it. And let's be absolutely clear, there is no sense whatever in which Russia's revisionist ambitions are confined to Ukraine. It would have been very, very easy at any point for Russia to have said to the West, and in particular to European audiences, some version of the following argument. We have some special historical interests, ties, responsibilities to Ukraine. We want to change the realities there, but we pose no threat whatsoever beyond Ukraine, and we wish peace with the rest of you. It would have been very easy for Russia to convey that message, and there have been plenty in Europe who would have been eager to accept that argument. On the contrary, what we've seen is that Russia has become increasingly aggressive towards the whole of Europe as it's become increasingly aggressive towards Ukraine. And among many other pieces of evidence, recall, of course, those two draft treaties that were presented at Putin's behest to the United States and to NATO at the end of 2021, which set out the ambition of a fundamental dismantling of the post-Cold War order, and in fact going in some respects even further back, demanding the complete withdrawal, for example, of American nuclear weapons. And just to add to one further detail that Sinikukka noted, it's not only the extent of the revisionist ambitions, but also the reckless urgency with which they're being pursued, in a way which really has no counterpart to the Cold War, where for most of that period, except for the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was essentially a rising power and confident in the long-term direction of history. What we see now is something much more reckless and dangerous. That takes us to your point about power. Now, compared to the Cold War, of course, Russia is, relatively speaking, much, much weaker than the Soviet Union was. Now, we all know this, but some of the details might startle us. So if you take Europe's total GDP as a reasonable first approximation of underlying military strength, then Europe's margin of superiority over Russia in GDP is greater than the margin of superiority that the whole of the Atlantic Alliance enjoyed over the whole of the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. It's a crushing degree of latent strength. Recall those famous arguments, Paul Kennedy in particular, in The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, his sort of grand tour d'horizon of 500 years of history. He charts the rise and fall of the great powers. One of his big conclusions, in fact, he wanted to sum up that great book in a single sentence. It would be something like, in a long war of vital interests, the bigger economy always wins. And that makes very good sense, of course, because in a long war of vital interest, you commit as much as possible of your national resources to that war. And the bigger your economy, the greater your capacity to make stuff, to turn plowshares into swords. Judged by that standard, Europe's capacity to constrain and ultimately defeat Russia, if it can turn that latent capacity into usable strength, is great indeed. And it's not just an economic point, it's a demographic point as well. Unlike the Cold War, Europe's demographic superiority, just the number of citizens, is 3.6 times greater than Russia. So again, if long wars are all about people and stuff, then Europe's inherent superiority is great indeed, greater than most of us realize. Now, of course, the key point, I'll keep this brief because there's a lot to discuss. The key point is turning that latent capacity into actual usable power, force. And the problem that Europe faces now, much greater than during the Cold War, is that this great reservoir of strength has to be funneled through the conduit of military spending. And most European finances are much more constrained now. Older, aging populations, greater welfare spending demands and so on. Real difficulties in my country, in France and most others. As Radek Sikorski said recently, most of Europe's credit cards are maxed out, except, of course, he said for Poland, also I think for Sweden, possibly Finland, I don't know. But the problem is how we push that latent superiority into a flow of usable capacity. This is one of Russia's few advantages, that its finances, the consistency of of Putin's fiscal policy, Russia's finances have been much more conservatively managed. They have greater headroom.
Okay, and Hanna, I wanted to ask you briefly. So, I mean, we see the relative strength of Europe, but of course, Russia has what we discussed last night in detail on the panel. There's always the nuclear option, and that's what has led so many policymakers to be wary of escalation risk, to perhaps treat Russia differently than its sort of size, economy, manpower would otherwise warrant. You're sort of looking a bit at Russia's nuclear posturing. That's obviously gone quiet for a while now. Is that something you expect Russia to be sort of pushing back into the conversation more if things get difficult, or have they tried that and it didn't work and we may have seen the last of it?
Yeah, I think if I think about the last 3.5 years, I think after this initial phase of Russian nuclear saber rattling, we had a growing frustration in Russia with, I think, what was perceived as the erosion of the credibility of Russia's nuclear coercion. And then through 2023 and 2024, certain steps up the nuclear escalation ladder in order to restore that coercive credibility, starting with President Putin's suspension of the participation in New START in February 2023. And then we had musings about nuclear testing, a highly publicized visit by Shoigu to Novaya Zemlya, the de-ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, other measures sort of leading us up to the revised nuclear doctrine in November of last year. And of course, we've also had maybe a small but especially loud segment of the Russian strategic community calling for quote-unquote more active nuclear deterrence, including even preemptive nuclear strikes on European cities. It seems to me that we have reached a certain peak with Russia trying to raise the nuclear temperature by last fall with the test of the Eurasian and the formalization of Russia's revised nuclear doctrine. And the reason why things have gone more quiet on that front recently, I think, was entirely context-driven. It had to do with the battlefield dynamics in Ukraine and a reduced perceived need on the Russian side to play the nuclear card. But also importantly, the advent of the second Trump administration, I think, led the Russians to be more cautious on that front. When I think ahead and what to expect sort of in the upcoming period, I think it's more likely that Russia will step up the types of actions that we've seen over the last 10 days. Kinetic action, airspace incursions, trying to test NATO's red lines, engage a US readiness to respond, as well as hybrid measures. I think Russia will be more cautious to play the nuclear card again, because Donald Trump has shown that he doesn't react well to that, especially to tweets by Dmitry Medvedev. So my sense is that Russia will be more cautious, which is not to say that we shouldn't expect as Europeans the possibility of future nuclear intimidation by Russia, especially if the coalition of the willing were to start implementing some of the measures that are being floated. And the last thing I'll say about this, Shaun, is that we have the New START treaty expiring in February of next year. There is zero indication right now that Russia has any appetite to engage in serious arms control conversations, whether that's on the nuclear or on the conventional front. It's very difficult to see that happening while the endgame in Ukraine is uncertain. And so we as Europeans will be entering, I think, a protracted period where Russia will have a massive advantage in terms of its non-strategic nuclear weapons. And we need to think very hard about what we can put on the table also to gain leverage vis-à-vis Russia in future arms control negotiations, to get Russia to agree to a reduction of those capabilities. And we need to think about, well, what is it that Russia fears? What is it that Russia doesn't like? Whether that's long-range precision strike or other capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And if I do want to reasonably soon open this up to questions, so if you've heard things that you want to clarify or argue with, please be prepared. Sam, I want to come to you. We'll drag ourselves back into the present in a moment. But when we were talking about this yesterday, I said that I thought, is it even possible to talk about what a post-Ukraine war security architecture might look like? Because it seemed to me there's so many variables. Does Ukraine win? Is Putin alive? Is Trump the president? Etc. How can we even start to think about this? And you said that actually there's a couple of key scenarios that cover most of this. So I'm really curious to hear how you see, in the medium to long term, what European security vis-a-vis Russia might look like.
Well, thanks, Shaun. I think we can make a few assumptions about Russia and the future of European security, as the title of our panel is stated. Russia will continue to exist. Russia will still pose a conventional nuclear and subconventional threat to NATO. And that Russia's relationship with the West will remain adversarial. I think those are sort of baseline assumptions that we should have about the future in dealing with Russia. And basically that means, I think, when we think about Russia and the future of European security, that we're facing choices between bad and worse, that there's nothing that's going to be good about this potential future security dynamic in Europe, and that there's no going back to anything that was like the pre-2022 status quo ante, which I should remind everyone wasn't so great either. But at least the way I think about it is that if we look for models here, you can think about two different periods of the Cold War as possible future scenarios for European security more broadly, dealing with Russia. When we think about the Cold War, in retrospect, often it seems like one uniform bloc, but really the 1950s were a completely different ballgame when there was a high degree of instability. In Europe in particular, we were in a period of acute confrontation with multiple crises over Berlin, an intervention in Hungary, and clearly the lines were not solidified, the rules were unclear, and there were multiple kinetic incidents involving Western militaries and the Soviet Union at the time. It's interesting in light of recent events to look back at those. I mean, in September of 1958, Soviet fighters shot down a U.S. Air Force C-130, which had strayed into Soviet Armenia at the time, killing 17 U.S. airmen, only 6 bodies of which were ever returned. And that followed an incident a few years earlier over northern Japan, where a Soviet fighter shot down an RB-29, again killing all 8 of the crew, none of which were recovered. And putting perhaps into context that some of the, or at least by comparative standards, what we saw a couple days ago. Although there were incidents in this region too. In November 1958, a Soviet fighter actually downed an RB-47 over Gotland in the Baltic Sea. So the 1950s were, highly unstable and quite a period of contestation that went beyond what our sort of imagined history of the Cold War has evolved to look like. But I think there is a second scenario that arguably is preferable, which is détente era Cold War, when we did have a series of agreements and understandings that stabilized the competition. There was bilateral U.S.-Soviet arms control. There were agreements on the German question. There was, of course, the Helsinki Final Act. This was obviously still a Cold War, a bitter confrontation, but it was a stable competition, particularly at the core. Obviously, it was very much a hot war for many countries on the so-called periphery of the competition in South America and Southeast Asia and Africa. But in Europe, there was a degree of comparative stability. And I think, these are two different kinds of outcomes we could imagine for an adversarial future relationship with Russia. Neither is going to be anything like what we had before, but they do represent, sort of a quite different nature of a future security environment. A lot depends on Russian intentions and objectives and how we get there, but I do think that, we have some agency in this too.
Right. Perhaps, I would like to respond to that because I think one thing is missing from your analysis is, of course, like the actors themselves, because, first of all, I think historical analogies are kind of analytical shortcuts, and like real-life shortcuts, they sometimes lead us astray, and we can't really get anywhere, or at least to the place that we would like to. In that respect, I think détente was possible, probably because, first of all, the West was very united, and it put considerable resources into maintaining that unity. Secondly, I think the Soviet Union was nevertheless a status quo power at the time. It wanted to maintain the security order in Europe, whereas now I think Russia is a revisionist state, and it wants to dismantle that. So I think that there is, the actors themselves are very different. And also, when it comes to the West, I don't think that we have such a unity, and we don't really have such an ironclad deterrence either. So the reality that we are facing today is much more that we have this eroding security system and a deterrence that Russia tests with its asymmetric strategy. And perhaps to Nigel, it is true that if you just look at the basically the capabilities or capacity, it might be that we are much stronger. But I think from the Moscow's perspective, it's all about the will. And being a great power is not about GDP. It's about the will to be a great power and the ability to deliver. And I think that the risk-taking is really a very, Russia's asymmetric strategy has really, and this kind of autocratic agility has given it kind of momentum, and it has achieved quite a lot, I think. So these are the things that we are dealing today, and somehow I just don't see that we have all those elements that we would, although we might have the will to build a cooperative, détente type of security arrangement in Europe.
So I'll just bring you in, Nigel, and then Sam, if you want to respond to any of that. So you also wanted to say something.
First, you're absolutely right, of course. And the way I'd put it is to say that there is a stark contrast between the balance of resources and the balance of resolve. The balance of resources dramatically favors Europe. Again, it's latent, It has to be turned into actual deliverable capability. That requires resolve, that requires determination and political choices. In a sense, that's a good problem to have, because solving the problem is in our gift. If we didn't have the resources, if the balance of resources favored Russia, then no matter how great our resolve, we would be in a very, very difficult situation. The point is we have the material capabilities. It's up to us to summon the political will and resolve. At the moment, the balance of resolve appears to favor Russia for all the reasons that you described, and Russia has been working hard, including the past week, to undermine and test our resolve further. Now, on the larger question of post-war security orders, it's never, although I think that the prospect even of realizing such an order is remote, I agree it's never too soon to begin to think about them. And glancing back at the past is interesting and always useful and can give us clues, while we recognize that the present circumstances are, in their own terms, unique. Now, as Sam said, it's an oversimplification to think about the Cold War as a single block of time. There's a great deal of variation in all sorts of details of it and the forms that it took. And it's for this reason that I think I'd be a little skeptical in suggesting that the height of détente could serve as, in any sense, a stable template for a future post-war security order, for at least two reasons. One is, yes, indeed, if you go back to 1975, it seemed pretty good. You had the Helsinki Final Act. You had various other forms of cooperation, SALT I and the ABM Treaty and so on had already been agreed. So these various mechanisms for regulating and stabilizing, but as Sam rightly said, not removing, not effacing the political ideological threat, but managing in safer ways. That was thickening and spreading and so on. You even had a space fight, Apollo and Soyuz sort of, linking in space with Soviet and Russian and American astronauts. But it was a moment. It was very, very brief. Already 2 years later, in 1977, the Soviet Union started deploying its SS-20s, a new generation of highly destabilizing weapons. 2 years after that, the SALT II process was dead. You had the invasion of Afghanistan. And then we were plunging into what I would argue is the most dangerous era of the Cold War, which is the early 1980s. And Able Archer and Operation Rian and all of that. Very, very difficult times. So, yes, you had that brief moment, but it really was just a moment. And in no sense, I think even at the time, it was inherently unstable and not something I think we can look back to with any confidence. The second reason is that the role of China then was fundamentally different from what it is today. It was the worry on the Soviet side of a rapprochement between the United States and China that was one of the factors that induced the Soviet Union to agree to a whole series of arms control measures. Now, to state the obvious, the situation that China faces now is very, very different, and its relationship with Russia now is fundamentally different. On the contrary, rather than China being, as it was in the 1970s, a factor propelling détente with the West, the fact today that China and Russia are so close, China is, to use NATO language, the decisive enabler of Russia's war on Ukraine. If anything, that would embolden Russia rather than encourage Russia to accommodate Western security interests.
Thank you. I mean, I don't want us to stay in the 1970s for too long, but I don't know, Sam, they don't like your détente analogy. I don't know if you want to respond back, if you have anything to say.
Well, it's funny. Historical analogies, are of course inherently limited. They're helpful in 5-minute presentations as heuristics to talk about models, as opposed to having to get into a lot of detail. I'm sure 1970s Western policymakers would be quite surprised to hear that the Soviet Union was a status quo power, that having been said, and also that the West was united, given, for example, the frictions between West Germany and the United States in the late 1970s. So I think we had our problems back then for sure as well. I think the point I would just take away from what we've just heard is that actually where we're most likely heading is a more 1950s style kind of confrontation rather than a 1970s one. And I would in fact, agree that that is the more likely outcome of this, that we're likely heading to a much more unstable, less regulated, less rule-governed in any way kind of competition with Russia in the post-Ukraine war, post-hot war period than a 1970s-esque one where there were more guardrails. So in that sense, I don't think there's any distinction or debate to be had among the three of us.
Okay, and as we mentioned China, I wanted to ask you, Hanna, you've just finished working on a book which sounds fascinating about, as I understand it, Russia's policies both in the near abroad and in what Russia would consider the near abroad and in more further afield. And I wonder, how do you see the rest of the world, both the places in Russia's backyard and also axis of upheaval, whatever you want to call it. How do all of these pieces fit into questions for Europe about European security and maybe also European competition with Russia in different areas?
Sure. I mean, I think if we want to talk about global Russia, the conversation could go into many directions. So let me focus on what I think is pertinent to our conversation about European security. And my starting point would be to say that while Russia has sunk so many resources into the war in Ukraine, we've actually seen a certain pattern of Russian inaction, if not retreat, in other parts of the world. And I think that will continue to be the case for as long as the war in Ukraine continues. I'm thinking of the South Caucasus, I'm thinking of the Middle East and the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, but also more broadly, Russia's inability to steer the developments in a post-October 7th Middle East into a favorable direction for Russia. I think about a year ago exactly, we were very concerned in Europe about Russian horizontal escalation, for instance, an enabling of the Houthis in Yemen in order to punish Europe for lifting restrictions on Ukraine's ability to strike into Russia. And it's not that we haven't seen Russian actions, but I think that concerns were overblown because of a combination of Russian bandwidth constraints and political calculus. We have not seen Russia lashing out against the West and other parts of the world as much as perhaps we feared. And so when I think about Europe and where Europe should prioritize, I think it's not trying to confront Russia in the rest of the world. I think it's really about focusing on Europe. And if I may, I think that extends to what we call the war of narratives or the information war. I think we've lamented a lot over the last 3.5 years that when we go to parts of the so-called global South, that perceptions of this war are not really shared, that the view that this war against Ukraine is an unprovoked war of aggression, that narrative doesn't fully resonate in those parts of the world, if I think about parts of Africa or India or the Middle East. And quite frankly, I'm not sure we can change those views. I'm not sure we can do all that much to undermine or disrupt Russia's cooperation with its partners in the global South. I think we're very limited. And when we think about narratives and sort of a view of the Russia threat, it's much more important to focus on our own societies and unity within Europe, both between countries, but also within societies to make sure we're on the same page. Now, having said all of that, if I may, Shaun, this is not to say that we shouldn't care about Russia's global activities and the threats that they can pose to Europe. And maybe I'll just highlight 3 areas that I monitor and that I think Europeans should monitor going forward. The biggest is the cooperation between Russia, China, the DPRK, and Iran. To my mind, it's not super useful to think of this as an axis. There's very little evidence of trilateral or quadrilateral cooperation between these countries. I think it's more important to ask what cooperation happens bilaterally between Russia and these other countries, and what the cumulative effects of that will be going forward. There's different ways to think about it. I think the Ukraine war has shown the additive advantage to Russia, receiving Shahed drone technology from Iran, munitions and soldiers from the DPRK, and vast amounts of dual-use goods from China. And we all know how that has added up in terms of enabling Russian capabilities. But there's other ways to think about these cumulative effects. We're now seeing Russia having acquired the Shahed technology and passing it on to the DPRK, which is a pretty interesting cascading effect. But there's also the Middle East and Africa. In a post-Assad Syria, it now looks like Russia will actually retain its bases on the Syrian coast, Khmeimim and Tartus. I think there's limits to what the Russians can do with that, again, while the war in Ukraine continues. But as we look beyond that, it seems that Russia will retain that foothold on the Eastern Mediterranean. And we can talk about the expansion of the Africa Corps in the Sahel, having replaced the Wagner Group's legacy operations there, but also going further, moving into further countries there. Again, Russia will be constrained in what it can do with that now, but it is also, I think, a strategic ambition to go beyond. And I think these are some of the theaters that the Europeans will need to continue to monitor.
Okay, in a moment I want to bring us back to Ukraine and to talk about security guarantees, but first I wanted to see if there are some people who have questions. Yes, there are. There was a very quick hand up over on this table here.
Shaun, here we are. Thank you, Shaun, and thank you to the panel. A compelling discussion and timely to say the least. My question is on two fronts. First, with respect to sanctions, and secondly, with respect to energy. It's been maybe just briefly touched on, but I recall famously John McCain saying that Russia's not a country. It's a mafia-run gas station masquerading as a country. And I guess that leads one to question whether much more could be done to choke off Russia's economy by actually enforcing sanctions, actually having a real effort to dissuade Russia's influence vis-a-vis their use of energy to fund their war, to fund their unjust activities and much of the malign influence that they have over the world. That's my question.
Anyone want to comment on that, and ideally briefly so that we can get a range of questions? Nigel.
Yeah, very, very briefly. And first is, if we're thinking about sanctions, we need to have in mind that the effects they could reasonably impose. Now, there are two approaches to this. One is to say, well, if you impose enough sanctions, Putin will change his mind. He will make a different policy choice because the costs are too great. That's for the birds. That won't happen. Putin's commitment to his goals in Ukraine is so great that only a fundamental challenge to the stability of the regime at home will cause him to revise his goals. That's my judgment of the ordering of his priorities. Therefore, look at the second way of thinking about sanctions. It's not that they contain Russia, but they constrain Russia. They make it materially and systematically and cumulatively harder for Russia to achieve the goal that it set itself. And to your point, yes, there is certainly more that the West can do. It's a matter partly of the design of sanctions, and there are more measures, especially on the with respect to constraining hydrocarbon revenues that are the lifeblood of the Russian economy. But secondly, just more systematic, effective, and consistent implementation. So just one glance back to the Cold War. In the Cold War, we imposed export controls, making it more difficult for the Soviet Union to get the things that it couldn't produce itself at scale and that it needed for its militarized economy. We didn't touch the flows of stuff going out of the Soviet Union, the oil and gas that sustained its economy essentially for the last 20 years. That's the new thing. That's the potent new thing that we're doing this time around. Export controls, stopping the technology getting to Russia, that's harder now. It's just a much more leaky sieve because global production is much more dispersed than it was in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. But what we are doing and not doing enough, but is the real critical vulnerability of the Russian economy, is going after those hydrocarbon revenues that pay for the imports, but also more broadly keep the Russian economy afloat. There's just more we can do there. And we should begin to think more creatively, for example, about using maritime power to enforce those sanctions on the shadow fleet.
Thank you. More questions. I'm going to take two. So Bobo Low, I could see over there. And then one over here as well afterwards.
Yes, my name is Bobo Lowe. Nigel, you mentioned China being a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. I want to push you a little bit on that. What do you mean by decisive enabler? Because there are several ways of interpreting this. One is that China's support for Russia has materially improved Russia's chances, military prospects in the war. And I think most people would say absolutely. But are you also saying that if China was not enabling Russia's war in Ukraine, Putin would be more disposed to reach a peaceful accommodation? Because I wonder whether that's really the case, whether that first overestimates the degree of Chinese influence on Russia, and second, given your comment about how committed Putin is to his goals in Ukraine, that with or without Chinese support, he would sustain that war in Ukraine until he thought he'd secured a decisive victory.
Okay, we'll do an answer to that one first and then come to you.
Very briefly, others, and Hanna in particular, you'll have thoughts. So they weren't my words, they were NATO's words, decisive enabler. I was borrowing them. So what did NATO mean? Well, Russia is now as a consequence of sanctions, Russia's global economic activity has been profoundly reoriented. China is an indispensable transit state for illicit goods into Russia. It's also an indispensable producer in its own right of a wide range of goods, including not just dual capable, but actually military goods now that Russia, again, cannot produce itself at scale and cannot get elsewhere. It is the arsenal of autocracy, put it that way. There are other forms of cooperation, various forms of intelligence cooperation as well, that China has provided on occasion. Now, and more to come. I think the canary in the coal mine here, coming out of the recent summary, is the apparent agreement to build the Paris-Siberia 2 pipeline. I think it's very, very significant. So Chinese, as you know, have resisted for a long time, now appear to have signed up to. Now, let's conduct the thought experiment you propose. If China weren't doing those things, and it was very anxious at the beginning of the war. It's taken some time for China to escalate these forms of support. What would Russia's position be? You used the word you asked whether Putin would be disposed to change his goals. And I come back to the previous discussion about sanctions. It's not a matter of Putin's choices so much as a matter of Russia's capabilities. I think Putin, it's very hard to imagine Putin abandoning in any fundamental way the goals he set himself. I think we need to think in terms of the historical psychological obsession. I don't think that's too strong a word that he has in Ukraine. It's therefore a matter of the capabilities that he brings to trying to implement that obsession. There's absolutely no doubt it would be much, much, much harder for Russia to sustain its war effort without the Chinese support. And let's turn from the hypothetical thought experiment to the possible future. Now, supposing there did come a moment when China, not saying it's likely, but just imagine the possibilities, because there are implications for Western policy. What would happen if China were, for whatever reason, to conclude at some point in the future that it no longer served Chinese interests to support Russia to this degree? I believe that Russia would very quickly find itself exposed. So the policy implication that follows from this is that I think we, Europe in particular, may be happening already, I don't know about it, but Europe in particular should conduct a quiet, very candid conversation with China about this war and about the outcomes. And China should be asked, what do you really want? What do you really actually want? And you're aware of the implications of potential risks and costs of continuing to support and indeed escalate support for Russia's war effort in the ways that you are.
Hanna.
just to add a quick point to Nigel's excellent points on the China question, and it's maybe a slightly more diffuse point and therefore not so much appreciated, but I think the position that China has taken on this war, not really to condemn this as a war of aggression, not to lean on Russia to end the war, platitudes of peace, a peace plan that is not really cannot really be operationalized, I think has also bought diplomatic space for a lot of other countries to take a sort of middle position, which is de facto a position that does not lean on Russia. I mean, from my own conversations with diplomats in Latin America, in Africa, countries for which China is enormously important in terms of the economic ties, you hear the argument, well, China has sort of taken a quote-unquote neutral position on this war, and so we sort of tend to align with that. So if you imagine a world in which China had come down much harder, leaning on Russia, it might have led other countries to also adopt a different position. So I think that's another factor, including in multilateralism, that should not be underappreciated either.
And there was a question over here. If we can get a microphone there, please.
Thanks. Neil Melvin from RUSI. I wanted to actually pick up on this sort of China issue, and particularly to ask Hanna something about her interesting comments about Russia's shifting position in Eurasia, because it strikes me that one of the differences between the Cold War and now was that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union saw itself as a European security actor, but the official Russian narrative is that the Ukraine war broke that relationship, and Russia now is building itself as a Eurasian actor. It sees Eurasia as the relevant space to engage with, and Russia is a peripheral part in their strategic thinking of this wider Eurasian order. And in the last year, we've even seen this overt project between Xi and Putin to build a Eurasian security order that's a little bit undefined, but sort of seems to weave together SCO and other institutions to set Eurasia at the center. So the first question is sort of how much significance should we give to that? Is that a real project? Because that does seem to redefine what European security starts to look like. I worked in the OSCE originally, and we had Vancouver to Vladivostok. This is clearly not the case. So Eurasia has a different relationship to European security. And within that project, as you said, Russia seems to be shifting in Eurasia, but it's now accommodating others. It's anti-Western, but it's letting others into Eurasia in a way we haven't seen before in the South Caucasus, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, all sorts of other, the Gulf. So does this also sort of have implications for European security that challenge that model that we've had for the last 50 years to deal with this space? We need to sort of engage different actors to actually accommodate that change.
Yeah, it's a complex question. I mean, I do think that on the rhetorical level, Russia professes to be this Eurasian power. It's become one of the sort of underpinnings of Russia's narrative as it portrays itself as a global power. But of course, things have become quite complicated for Russia in Eurasia, as you rightly pointed out, in the South Caucasus and in Central Asia, because these countries have engaged in their own forms of foreign policy hedging and diversification. If I think of a country like Armenia, especially after the abandonment of the Karabakh Armenians, and Azerbaijan and Turkey pushing way above their weight if we compare it to 5 years ago, but also the Central Asian countries engaging in greater foreign policy diversification, though I say this with the caveat that all of them also continue to depend economically a lot on Russia, and the entanglement between elites and Russia, is also a continued reality. We see China as a bigger player in that part of the world, and from what I understand, the Chinese forays are not something that Russia looks upon lightly. I think there's a certain degree of competition between Russia and China in a place like Kazakhstan, for instance, as opposed to a sort of emerging condominium or cooperation. And so it's true that this whole landscape is becoming more crowded, other actors stepping up their game. I think Israel and Iran took their proxy confrontation in the South Caucasus to another level with the war in Ukraine. And so what that means for Europeans is that landscape, I think, is becoming a lot more complicated and a lot more fluid, with more and more actors sort of stepping up their own efforts in that region.
And Sinikukka?
Yeah, perhaps I could just continue from there. I think we shouldn't really think about that it would be either or. I think it is that, in a way, the success in Europe and kind of redefining the European security order will then also then reflect back to Russia's role in Eurasia or in Central Asia or Caucasus or so on. I think it is really that is the key to then kind of regaining dominance also in other parts of the world. So it's not so much that now Russia is shifting, but it is both at the same time, and they are kind of dependent on each other.
I wanted to bring us back. I mean, this is such a kind of all-encompassing topic that it could have gone in so many different ways, but I wanted to bring us back. We've got 10 minutes left to, here and now in Europe, where it seems like, the most pressing, obviously, security challenge when it comes to Russia is what happens with the Ukraine war, how is a settlement reached, and what do the sort of so-called guarantees look like? And I just wanted to really ask everybody what they think about this issue. So there's two kind of opposing things that I feel like I've heard in the last week. Last week in Kiev, Radoslav Sikorski, who clearly is not known as a dove on Russia and Ukraine, but he was saying, like, I'm sick of this talk of security guarantees. If people were willing to fight Russia, they could be fighting Russia now. The idea that we're saying, we'll have a peace, and then if Russia comes back, we will fight them, seems to be not a genuine guarantee, and there's nothing more dangerous than a non-genuine guarantee. Conversely, President Stubb here and, when we were later talking for a Guardian interview, basically when pushed said, yes, the war has to finish first before there's any security guarantees, but once those security guarantees are in place, by definition, they mean that Europe will go to war with Russia, or the guarantors of the security guarantees will go to war with Russia if Russia comes back to Ukraine. So I'm curious to hear from the panel. I mean, how realistic is this? Is this something that's strategic communication to the White House, to the Ukrainian people, or is it something that could potentially have real substance as something close to an Article 5 guarantee? And anyone who wants to talk about that. I
can dive in.
Yeah, go for it.
Strange to find myself maybe agreeing with Radoslav Sikorski, but I do 100% would agree with that. I think, the question about guarantees, most importantly, is about the credibility of those guarantees, right? And so is it credible to pledge to go to war for the next iteration of a war that you're not currently willing to go to enter in? And I think that's a question that Western governments need to ask, and I think it's a legitimate one. I do think that there are things that Western governments, potential guarantors, can pledge to do that would be credible, and pledge to do in this context in the event of future armed aggression that they wouldn't be willing to do in peacetime, that could potentially have a deterrent effect. But going to war with Russia, as demonstrated by their unwillingness to do so in the moment, presently, is not a particularly credible commitment.
Anyone else want to come in on that? Yeah.
I mean, it all puts the cart before the horse. How can we talk about security guarantees in a hypothetical post-war future while the immediate and urgent task is to create the conditions that would bring all sides to the negotiating table? And I believe we're further away from that than ever. So it is a distraction. It's political leaders talking about making, at this point, fairly empty hypothetical promises, when, to repeat, the immediate urgent task is to marshal the resources that ensure that it will make sense at some point to talk about how, about the shape of a possible peace and the forms of guarantee that could stabilize it. And I fully share Sam's view that there is a contradiction between saying, on the one hand, today we are not willing to fight Russia, but tomorrow we may be willing to do so. Security guarantee, I mean, the language is very slippery. A guarantee, it's a sort of a benign formulation, security guarantee. It risks concealing the commitments inherent in that. Security guarantee means that you are prepared to escalate if Russia aggresses again. And escalating specifically would mean, in those circumstances, fighting against Russia. We've shown no appetite to do that today. Under what circumstances might we do that tomorrow? I think there are particular problems with the still vague proposals for a reassurance force, so-called, for many reasons. I think there are all sorts of perils and traps. And just to take one of them, so Mike Hoffman yesterday made the important point. Ukraine understands the new way of war better than anyone else in respect of technology, tactics, battle management, and so on. The rest of us are novices at best in that. The bow and arrow, if you recall, Mike said. How can it be that a few thousand European troops would preserve peace in a way that a vastly larger native Ukrainian army, well versed in the new way of war, would not? What really would Europe add?
Yeah, well, perhaps just a few words. The thing is that now we are talking about something like in relative near term, but I can imagine futures where the security guarantees would really be there. Like, for example, if in a decade's time, for example, Ukraine is member of the EU, I think that would kind of change that situation. And I think that gradually, and the thing is that also I think Russia does misunderstand Europe. Europe is not very decisive, it is very slow, but what we have seen is that it does have staying power as well. I mean, for example, in the Caucasus and for example, I mean, and also in Moldova, that there is some staying power that, for example, if there has been a crisis management mission, it has stayed, and it hasn't been like something that has been there for 5 years and then be taken off, but we are talking about decades already. So, so this kind of gradual processes are something that Russia does not necessarily understand that well. And I do see that, for example, the situation and the relationship between Ukraine and Europe today is so very different than it was prior to the war. And if that trend continues, as I foresee, I do believe that there could be a credible security guarantee and also like understanding in Europe that Ukraine indeed is a European country and that it is vital to our security.
At this point, it's Ukraine that's been guaranteeing European security rather than the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'm open to the prospect of that kind of also happening the other way around in future.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes left, so I want you to indulge me in a ridiculous and unanswerable hypothetical question. So Putin has a heart attack tomorrow, and there's some kind of reconfiguration in the Kremlin elite. There's a new Russian government of whatever stripe within this unpredictable scenario it might take. You know, Nigel, you talked about Ukraine being an obsession for Putin, which I think is the case. We know that a lot of the Russian elite was dragged into this somewhat unwillingly, although now seems to have made their peace with it. Is there a sort of sensible Russian foreign policy establishment lurking kind of in undercover in Russia that would be ready for a recalibration with Europe and for some kind of détente-style deal? Or does it go much deeper? And for this very easy question, we've got about a minute left. So if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So let's return to one of the points that Sam made about the ragged, unstable 1950s. Now, one of the most dangerous moments was the outbreak of the Korean War. The Soviet Union didn't really take part in, but it authorized. Now, recall that went on for 3 years. And while Stalin was alive, there was no sense in which any member of the Politburo could possibly disagree, even hint at disagreement with Comrade Stalin. When he died, things began to change very quickly. Not fundamentally, of course, the system remained fundamentally repressive, but you began to get a thaw in the first weeks and first months. And most important of all, that war that had been raging for 3 years was brought to an end. And it required Soviet diplomacy to do that. And we know from memoir testimony of Khrushchev and others that those around Stalin were very alarmed by the Korean War. And they're very afraid it would go nuclear, especially when the Eisenhower administration took office at the beginning of 1953. They could, of course, say, let alone do, absolutely nothing while Stalin was alive. And yet they took the first opportunity they could, once Stalin was out of the way, once the author of this war was out of the way, to bring it to an end. It didn't mean the confrontation with the West ended. The Cold War continued. It took slightly different forms. But the war that had been raging, that had, again, been authored by the now dead leader, was brought to a close. So there's a part of me that holds out, to your point, that the center of elite gravity was very skeptical and alarmed about this war. That could coalesce again.
Okay. On that note, we're out of time. Congratulations. We managed to do a whole panel almost without mentioning the guy in the White House. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. Thanks to all of the panelists. The next panel will be at 10:15. There's a short break. Thank you.